Well, if you read the Little Children Are Sacred report about what's going on in regional communities for Aboriginal people, it's pretty clear that one of the fundamental reasons there's a gap is because the police are no longer allowed to incarcerate or arrest the adults in those communities who have been abusing women and children in a way that if anybody in Europe was to see or hear what was going on, they'd be absolutely shocked at what has been happening in these communities. It's got nothing to do with colonialism, nothing to do with city Australians, and everything to do with dysfunction within those communities that's being left because,
Absolutely.
I mean, the more activism that seems to go on, the worse the situation gets, which says to me that perhaps we should have a review and take stock of activism before we start entrenching it in the Constitution. And you made a great point, Ramesh, that the reason that Australia is such a successful multicultural country is because our Constitution makes no distinguishment between Australians. We are all Australians, equally so, and that's important. But I wanted to ask you, plenty of other countries have gone down the path of treating people differently, whether that's through affirmative action based upon race or other historical overhangs. Has that ended well in anywhere that you've heard of?
Not that I'm aware of, nowhere. And in fact, it's been called to a halt in the US recently by the Supreme Court decision on university admissions. Most Australians don't realize, by the way, that suit was actually brought by and on behalf of Asian Americans.
Really?
Because on merit, yes, on merit, they would be vastly overrepresented in places like Harvard and in this case also University of North Carolina, I think. But in fact, to be successful for admission into Harvard as an Asian American, you have to score several points in double digits more than a black student. So once again, policy promoted in the name of tolerance and inclusivity, in fact, ended up being exclusive and exclusionary. And so they said this is un-American. And essentially quoted back an old, I think from 2007, Chief Justice John Roberts saying that the best way to end racial discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race.
No kidding. That would seem to be an obvious answer, is if you want to end discrimination, just stop discriminating.
Yep. So it reverses Martin Luther King's famous statement that you must judge someone or the content of the character not on the basis of the color of their skin or pigmentation. Now we want to reverse that. So people who gain no rewards from what happened in the past must be punished now to reward those who have themselves suffered no racism, but their ancestors somewhere in the distant past did. Those days are gone. There are tremendous progress that has been made across the board. And on the question of affirmative action, again, most people don't realize the biggest experiment in affirmative action for the longest time has been in India. This was a clause actually there were two clauses that was written into the Indian Constitution back in 1950, and it's set out in two annexes, two schedules that they call them, scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. And you know what? That program was meant to have finished in 1965 on the reasoning that it's a temporary program. We'll get our positive results from this, and then we will be able to abolish it. Surprise, surprise. Not only is that program still going, it has expanded in scope, it has expanded in the sectors it covers. The court has stepped in and limited such admissions and recruitment and promotions to a maximum of 50%, which is breached in practice in many places. And more groups want to be added to the list. Bobby Jindal, the former governor, if I remember, of Louisiana, he made the point that once you realize that material benefits and advantages flow, parents are ordering DNA tests for their kids in the hope that somewhere along the line they'll be able to identify some protected minority blood that they have inherited, on the basis of which they can claim preferred admissions or preferred jobs. The same thing happens in India. If we are going to go through with the voice and these things follow, the clamor for actual DNA testing to establish Aboriginal ancestry, I think, will grow. So that will divide and embitter Aboriginal communities even more. In other words, the scope for worsening every set of issues is actually much more, much greater than for improving them, I think.